What do you think
If
you're
you think
doing?
HOA
This is
drama
private
can't turn
property. This
deadly,
is HOA property.
you haven't met the people who tried to kill my brother over a dock permit.
Ma'am, please step away.
I never thought a quiet weekend at the lake cabin would turn into a manhunt, bullets flying, and my brother fighting for his life just because some HOA president thought he owned the land beneath our feet. What these petty neighborhood tyrants didn't know is that my brother isn't just anyone. He's a sitting United States senator. Once they sent their fake cop with a loaded gun to shut us up, they lit a firestorm they could never contain. Make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories right now so you never miss a moment of this unbelievable tale, because it only gets wilder from here. It all started 3 months ago when my brother Daniel finally took a break from DC and flew in to join me at our family lake cabin, a peaceful wooden retreat we'd inherited from our grandfather, nestled on the edge of Lake Chelton. We'd grown up spending summers here, fishing, swimming, watching the stars at night, and chopping wood during the day. The place had a sense of history, of roots, of belonging. But things had changed in the past 2 years. What used to be unincorporated lakefront land slowly got taken over by a newly formed HOA called Lakeshore Preservation Committee. A bunch of retirees and weekend warriors had come together to beautify and protect the neighborhood, which in reality meant they wanted to control every cabin, every mailbox, every paddleboard, and every tree on the lakefront like it was their own kingdom. At first it was just annoying letters, notices about trimming bushes, complaints about my truck parked too close to the water. Then it escalated. They started issuing fines, warning us about unauthorized dock modifications when Daniel had simply reinforced the old beams with new wood. It was absurd. We ignored most of it because we knew our cabin wasn't even under their jurisdiction. The HOA's coverage map clearly stopped half a mile away, and our land predated their committee by decades, but they didn't care. Karen Latham, the self-declared president of the HOA, had made it personal. She hated Daniel the moment she saw him on our porch, sipping coffee in his suit and talking on the phone with a Senate aide. I think she Googled him, figured out who he was, and suddenly saw dollar signs, or power, or both. She started accusing us of everything from code violations to disrespecting community values. It was obvious she didn't like having someone she couldn't control in the neighborhood. Things came to a head the weekend after the 4th of July. Daniel had just arrived late Friday night. I had already fired up the grill, and we were planning to spend the weekend off-grid. No politics, no press. Just two brothers, beers in hand, watching the sunset like we used to when we were kids. Saturday morning, we woke to a letter taped to the dock ladder. It was from the HOA, citing us for unauthorized structure usage, and demanding we dismantle our dock within 72 hours or face removal and legal consequences. It was laughable. We took it off, tossed it in the fireplace, and thought nothing more of it. But that was a mistake. Sunday evening, we saw a black SUV roll up the gravel road and park just outside our gate. A man stepped out, wearing what looked like a uniform, dark slacks, a tactical belt, shirt with a stitched hand patch that said Chelton Community Enforcement Division. I had never heard of such a department. He looked more like a mall cop than a real officer, but he was carrying a sidearm. That immediately made me suspicious. Daniel was calm, polite, as always. He walked out and asked the man if he needed something. The guy said he was sent by the HOA to inspect unauthorized shoreline structures. Daniel told him he had no authority here, and unless he had a warrant or was an actual law enforcement officer, he had no right to be on our property. That's when things turned. The man's hand went to his gun. He didn't draw it, but it was a clear threat. I stepped out too, holding my phone, and told him I was recording everything. Daniel asked for a badge number. The man refused. Then he said something chilling. "We warned you people. Time's up." Then he reached for his radio and started talking into it in codes, like he was part of some operation. Daniel calmly told him to leave immediately, or he'd call the sheriff. That made the man smirk. "You think the sheriff's gonna come? This far out for a trespass call?" And he said, "You're not untouchable, Senator?" That's when we knew something was very wrong. He wasn't just some overzealous HOA contractor. This was a planned threat, a message, maybe worse. We stepped back, locked the cabin, and called the real authorities. It took nearly 4 minutes for a deputy to show up. By then the SUV was gone. But we had the video. We showed the footage to the deputy, who raised his eyebrows and said, "That's not one of ours." I don't even think he's with the town. He ran the plates on the SUV from the security footage, and guess what? Fake tags. The car was unregistered. This wasn't some HOA dispute anymore. It was criminal. And Daniel, being who he was, wasn't about to let it go. That night, he made some calls. Quiet ones. Not through official Senate channels, but through friends at the DOJ and a contact he had in the U.S. Marshals. By Monday morning, there were 3 black Suburbans parked at our cabin, but this time, they were real. Badges, guns, suits. The HOA had no idea what kind of fire they just poked. It wasn't long before they started uncovering records, surveillance. HOA meeting minutes that suggested Karen and her inner circle had been scheming to clean up the neighborhood and remove problem owners through private enforcement. They had hired a private security firm made up of disgraced ex-cops and failed bounty hunters. And that man who came to our property, he had a sealed record in another state, 2 assault charges, and was working off the books. Kieran had written him a personal check, calling it land management consulting. It was a cover for attempted intimidation or worse. Over the next few days, things unraveled fast. Marshals issued subpoenas. HOA members clammed up. Karen tried to lawyer up, but was clearly in over her head. And Daniel, well, he made it very clear in a press call that the incident at his family's lake property was under federal review, but things weren't done. Not even close. Because that fake cop wasn't acting alone, and what happened next would take us far beyond HOA fines and straight into a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone expected. What we thought was the peak of the madness was actually just the first crack in the dam. After the press call went live, Daniel flew back to Washington under the protection of federal agents. But I stayed behind at the cabin, determined not to be run off our land. The place wasn't just property, it was our bloodline, our memories, and our right. Within days of Daniel's public statement, the HOA office was raided by local authorities acting under direction from the DOJ, and what they found buried in emails and hard drives blew the roof off the entire situation. Karen and her so-called preservation committee had been running what amounted to a neighborhood extortion ring, complete with surveillance operations, hired muscle, and even a database of residents they labeled as non-compliant and subject to influence. That list included over a dozen homeowners around the lake, many of whom had previously sold their cabins abruptly after run-ins with the HOA people who just disappeared overnight. Some who reportedly left the state entirely. It turned out that the HOA had weaponized property regulations as a means of control and intimidation, demanding outrageous fees or threatening legal action. And when that didn't work, they turned to this security consultant who showed up with his fake badge and real gun. But here's where things got darker. The man who visited us at the cabin, who had his hand on the trigger that night, didn't just have a sealed criminal history, also had connections to a defunct private military contractor that had been shut down years ago for violations overseas. This wasn't just a loose cannon ex-cop. This was someone who knew how to disappear, how to blend in, and how to use intimidation with precision. The more the marshals dug, the more they found evidence suggesting this man had been paid more than once to visit homeowners who refused compliance. One of those homeowners had been injured in a hunting accident the year before. Another had gone missing entirely, his cabin sold through a power of attorney signed under unclear circumstances. It was as if Karen and her inner circle had created a shadow justice system in the neighborhood, one that operated without oversight, without boundaries, and with violence as its fallback. Meanwhile, the local police were eerily quiet. Few deputies seemed cooperative with the investigation, but the sheriff himself had started avoiding press inquiries. Daniel's contacts in the Senate had begun to ask the right questions, and whispers of a deeper connection started to circulate. Could it be that someone in local law enforcement had turned a blind eye to Karen's operations? Or worse, were they involved? That question became critical when I received an unmarked envelope in our cabin's mailbox. No return address, just a USB drive and a printed photo of Daniel walking along the dock, circled in red ink. Inside the envelope was also a note: "You don't belong here. Take the hint, or next time we won't miss." I immediately handed it over to the marshals, who escalated the threat level. Suddenly, this wasn't just a harassment case. It was an active assassination attempt in the making. What the drive contained was even more chilling. Video footage from a drone, our cabin, our dock, me chopping wood. Daniel reading under the umbrella? They'd been watching us probably for weeks, maybe months. The timestamps proved the drone had been circling long before the fake officer made contact. Whoever was behind this had planned the encounter, had studied us, and had likely been ordered to do more than just warn. That changed everything. Daniel returned that weekend, this time with 2 federal agents, and we stayed locked inside the cabin most of the day, armed and watchful. We knew we couldn't rely on the HOA members to talk. They had all gone underground, many of them lawyering up with the same firm out of state. Suspicious in itself. Karen had stopped showing up to her house entirely, according to neighbors. She had vanished. But what broke the case wide open wasn't the USB or even Karen's emails. It was one of the HOA's board members, a man named Leonard Griffin, who cracked. Leonard was in his late 60s, a former accountant, and he'd joined the HOA years ago to help clean up the lake. But he hadn't signed on for violence. When he saw the headlines about Daniel being targeted, he realized he was in way over his head. One night, Leonard knocked on the door of the federal safe house Daniel was temporarily assigned to and asked to talk. What he revealed stunned even the agents. Leonard said that Karen had been in contact with a man named Mitchell Quinn, the so-called security officer who'd visited our property. But Mitchell wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger group known as Echelon 9, a loosely organized private enforcement ring of ex-military and law enforcement personnel who operated under their radar contracts, mostly for wealthy clients or corrupt agencies. Karen had hired them through a shell company to remove obstacles to her HOA expansion plan. Her goal wasn't just the lakefront, it was regional control. She wanted to turn the HOA into a real estate development empire, acquire distressed properties for pennies, flip them under the guise of beautification, and sell them to high-end buyers. The cabins that refused, they were to be dealt with. Leonard even provided meeting recordings. One in particular captured Karen saying, "The senator will fold or disappear. Either way, he's a headline and a warning." That was all. The DOJ needed. Arrest warrants were issued. Karen was tracked down in a motel 2 towns over, trying to leave the state. Mitchell Quinn remained on the run. A multi-agency manhunt was launched. The entire HOA board was brought in for questioning. Still, it didn't feel over, because the question lingered: how far up did this go? Who else knew? Who else signed off? And would Mitchell come back to finish what he started? The manhunt for Mitchell Quinn turned our quiet lakeside community into something unrecognizable. A place where agents roamed in unmarked vehicles and drones circled overhead, watching for any trace of movement in the woods. The federal team, assigned to Daniel, had increased their presence tenfold, transforming our lake cabin into a tactical outpost with equipment humming day and night. Windows blacked out, motion detectors everywhere, and a mobile surveillance unit parked beneath the trees. Despite all that, we couldn't shake the fear that Mitchell was nearby, watching us, waiting. He had slipped out of the state once already, disappearing into a web of backcountry roads and safe houses set up by Echelon 9. The rogue network we now understood had ties that stretched across the country, meanwhile the DOJ began tearing apart. The real estate arm Karen had secretly formed under the Lakeshore HOA banner, a subsidiary called Emerald Holdings. Through shell LLCs and forged appraisals, she had already acquired 8 lakeside properties by exploiting elderly homeowners. With legal pressure and veiled threats, those who didn't cave had suffered break-ins, mysterious fires, or injuries that never made the news. What was once considered eccentric HOA overreach now read like a criminal enterprise of racketeering, extortion, and organized threats. But what haunted me more than the logistics of the operation was the fact that we almost became one of their success stories. Another cabin sold under duress, another headline buried under real estate jargon. If Daniel hadn't been who he was, if I hadn't filmed that fake cop, we might have vanished into their silent portfolio of victims. Still, none of it felt over because Mitchell was out there, and every night I felt him in the trees, in the shadows beyond the dock, as if he was waiting for the right moment to finish the job. 2 weeks after Karen's arrest, we received an untraceable call routed through several encrypted lines. A voice on the other end said only one word: soon. That night, every agent's nerves were on edge, scanning every camera feed, every vibration in the ground, expecting an attack, but nothing came. Days passed, then a week. The DOJ assumed Mitchell had either fled to Mexico or was hiding in an echelon stronghold deep in Appalachia. But I had a different theory. I believed he hadn't left at all. I believed he was waiting for Daniel to drop his guard. And Daniel, despite everything, still believed in playing by the rules. He refused to flee, refused to back down, and insisted on staying at the cabin to send a message that we would not be bullied off our own land. That conviction almost got him killed. It was the third Saturday since the incident when the unthinkable happened. Around 2:30 a.m., all motion sensors triggered at once. Our power line was cut. Backups failed within seconds, likely jammed. Every agent jumped to their posts, but it was too late by the time we got eyes on the dock. A figure in full tactical gear had already made it to the cabin steps. He was fast, trained, moving like a ghost through the shadows, and Worsey knew the layout. He had clearly been there before. 2 agents tried to intercept him, but one was shot through the thigh with a suppressed round, and the other was knocked unconscious in a brutal melee that ended with a smashed jaw. I grabbed the shotgun we kept by the fireplace and positioned myself near the back door, while Daniel was rushed upstairs by the remaining agent. In the chaos, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass breaking near the kitchen side window. He was inside. My hands trembled, my breath shallow, every moment stretching into eternity. I waited until I saw the shadow move across the hall, and fired once. The blast echoed, ripping through drywall and glass, but I missed. Silence followed, then a flashbang detonated in the living room, stunning us both. The agent upstairs yelled into his radio, but comms were still jammed. Everything had gone black. Then I heard Mitchell. "Senator, come on out. This isn't political anymore. It's personal now." His voice was calm, measured, as if we were playing poker, not facing death. I tried to move toward his location, but a second shot grazed my shoulder, sending me tumbling into a side table. I lay there, blood soaking through my shirt, vision blurred, trying to stay conscious. That's when Daniel stepped out. No weapon, just his voice. "You're finished." "Mitchell, you made this political the moment you pulled a gun on me." Mitchell laughed. "I warned you. You didn't listen. Karen might have cracked, but I don't." Then came the sound of rapid footsteps and a crash. Daniel had lured him toward the stairwell, and the remaining agent came down from above, tackling Mitchell mid-sentence. A brutal fight erupted, fists and knees thudding against wood, furniture splintering. And then, finally, the sickening thud of a gun clattering to the floor. They subdued him. It was over. Mitchell Quinn was in custody, bruised, bleeding, but alive. He was handed over to the U.S. Marshals within the hour. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt safe. The aftermath was immediate and thunderous. News outlets across the country ran the story. Senator targeted an HOA hit plot security firm, tied to national network of illegal operations. Congressional hearings were announced within days. The DOJ expanded its probe into Echelon 9, uncovering ties to multiple violent evictions, land seizures, and even a pair of unsolved murders that now looked like contracted hits. Daniel testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee, not just as a victim, but as a witness to the threats ordinary Americans faced when unchecked authority mixed with private power. The HOA was dissolved entirely, and its board members faced charges ranging from conspiracy to attempted murder. Karen struck a plea deal in exchange for information on Emerald Holdings' national partners. She cried on the stand, blaming overzealous ambition and poor judgment. But no one in that courtroom believed for a second she didn't know exactly what she was doing. Leonard Griffin received immunity and now speaks out about HOA abuse across the country. And me? I finally felt like I could breathe again at our cabin, though I still double-locked the doors and checked the woods before sunset. But the scars are permanent. Our lake isn't quiet anymore, not to us. It's a place of survival, of justice, and a reminder that sometimes the fight for peace means confronting monsters that wear neighborly smiles. Asterisk, after Mitchell's capture and the chaos surrounding our cabin began to settle, we found ourselves in the eye of a national storm we never asked for but could no longer ignore. The press hounded Daniel day and night, swarming outside Senate chambers, staking out the cabin, camping near the courthouse where HOA members were being processed one by one. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a headline that struck a chord across the country, exposing just how easily homeowners associations could evolve into tyrannical private governments when left unchecked. But while the world focused on Daniel's testimony, the legal dominoes, and the sensational trials, something else had begun to weigh on us, something deeper, more personal. The cabin wasn't the same. I'd find myself sitting by the fire, staring at the repaired window Mitchell had smashed through, wondering if there were more like him still out there. Daniel tried to stay calm, tried to appear composed during his Senate hearings, but I could see the shadows under his eyes, the way he never sat with his back to a door anymore. The man who once stood firm in D.C. without blinking in the face of political pressure now checked behind every curtain. We were both changed. The feds had given us a full security detail, including periodic patrols and surveillance sweeps around the cabin. But we learned quickly that security didn't mean safety, especially not when someone tried to break into the DOJ evidence locker 3 weeks later, the same locker holding all of Karen's files, Leonard's recordings, and Mitchell's personal gear, including his encrypted laptop. The break-in failed, but the message was clear. Someone still wanted the truth buried. That discovery led to a deeper investigation into Emerald Holdings' broader network. Turns out Karen wasn't just a small-town power-hungry lunatic. She had partners in other states, and other HOAs, all of them following the same playbook, weaponizing community, bylaws to seize land, flip properties, and suppress resistance. HOA boards from Arizona to Georgia were suddenly under scrutiny. DOJ launched what they called Operation Backlot, a sweeping probe into paramilitary-style intimidation via private community enforcement networks. And Daniel, despite being the target, became the face of the resistance. He started drafting legislation, the homeowners' protection and oversight. A bill designed to place federal accountability measures on HOAs operating in unincorporated zones. It proposed strict guidelines on enforcement authority, outlawed private security contracts without oversight, and introduced mandatory transparency for HOA budgets and operations. As noble as that work was, it didn't stop the nightmares. One night, around 3 a.m., I found Daniel sitting on the dock alone, staring into the dark water, gripping a baseball bat. No phone, no agents nearby, just him and the silence. I asked him what he was doing, and he said quietly, making sure he doesn't come back. The trauma was embedded now. The attack wasn't just on him, it was on our legacy, our home, and everything we thought we understood about security in our own country. Meanwhile, Karen's trial began in full force. She had pleaded guilty to multiple charges in exchange for leniency, but her courtroom demeanor was cold, calculated. She acted like a CEO who'd just miscalculated a market move, not someone who'd sent a hired gun to kill a U.S. senator. Her defense team claimed she was manipulated by Echelon 9 operatives and that Mitchell had acted without her approval. But the tapes Leonard had turned in told a different story. In one particularly damning recording, Karen explicitly discussed neutralizing the cabin asset and how the senator's influence can't be allowed to spread. That was the moment the jury's faces changed. The verdict was swift guilty on all major counts. She was sentenced to 35 years without parole. Some cheered. I felt nothing. There was no satisfaction in seeing her cuffed and dragged from the courtroom because we had already lost something that couldn't be restored. Trust. Trust in our neighbors. Trust in civility. Trust in the illusion that home meant safe. Mitchell refused to testify at Karen's trial. Instead, he remained in solitary confinement, tight-lipped, refusing even legal counsel for weeks. Eventually, he was moved to a federal facility out of state and became part of a separate investigation into Echelon 9's deeper operations. Rumors swirled that he'd been involved in off-the-books operations overseas, including black site interrogations. and rogue surveillance projects, that's when another chilling connection was uncovered. Echelon 9's founder was a former intelligence contractor who'd once consulted for the Department of Homeland Security. The group had been officially dissolved after a scandal, but clearly continued to operate under new shells, funding their work through private clients like Karen, who wanted their own personal enforcers. When the Senate Intelligence Committee began hearings into this, Daniel found himself at the center once again. But this time, he wasn't just a witness. He was a target for criticism, too. Some claimed he was exploiting the incident for political gain. Others accused him of pushing anti-freedom legislation by proposing oversight on private communities. Daniel weathered the backlash with the same calm demeanor he used to field threats at our dock. But behind closed doors, I saw the toll it took. The quiet moments when he rubbed his temples, sighed at night without words, and scrolled endlessly through reports, cross-checking every name, every mention of Echelon 9, looking for what we still didn't know. Then came the letter. It arrived. In a plain white envelope, no postage, hand-delivered to the Senate office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in blocky font. The cabin was only the beginning. Emerald still breathes. No fingerprints. No DNA. Just a message that reopened every wound we had tried to heal. The DOJ launched another sweep, this time targeting what they believed to be sleeper arms of the Emerald Holdings network. Arrests were made in Florida, Utah, and Nevada. HOA presidents, real estate brokers, and security contractors were all pulled into the widening net. But still, Emerald's top leadership remained a mystery. The real bosses, the ones Karen answered. Two were ghosts, protected behind layers of corporate secrecy and legal fog. Our lake cabin, once our refuge, now felt like the center of a national manhunt, and we were still at the heart of it. Even as Daniel pressed forward with his bill, even as more names were exposed and networks dismantled, we couldn't escape. The truth that somewhere out there, the real architects of this entire nightmare were still watching. 3 months had passed since the letter arrived at Daniel's Senate office. And though federal authorities had made more than 24 arrests tied to Emerald's spiderweb of front companies and rogue enforcement squads, the truth was undeniable. Central body that controlled the entire operation remained untouched, invisible, and alive. Every time we thought we'd cut off the last head of the beast, another surfaced in a different state under a different name with a different scheme. One of the DOJ analysts assigned to the case said it best. This isn't just one HOA gone. Wrong, this is a nationwide parasite system, feeding on fear, lawlessness, and complacency. Daniel's bill had passed the Senate with bipartisan support. But that small legislative victory was no consolation to either of us, especially after. Another envelope appeared this time, not at his office, but directly on our cabin's porch, sealed in blood-red wax. Inside, it was a single photo. Not of me, not of Daniel, but of our mother, standing in her garden 2 days earlier, smiling at something off camera. Written on the back in bold black marker were 5 words, "Tell him to stand down." That message shattered any illusion that this was over. Our family was in the crosshairs again, not because of anything we'd done wrong, but because Daniel refused to be silent. I flew our mother out that night under armed protection. Daniel and I returned to the cabin the next morning and called an emergency meeting with the feds. The agents on the case, now operating under the umbrella of a new joint task force, confirmed our worst fear. Whoever remained in control of Emerald had resources and reached far deeper than they initially thought. They weren't just HOA presidents and shady brokers. They had connections to cybersecurity firms, surveillance contractors, ex-intelligence officers, and even international money laundering networks. The cabin became ground zero again, this time for digital forensics. Every square inch of the property was swept, and hidden cameras were discovered embedded in the trees surrounding our dock. Buried in birdhouses, even hidden inside a rock near the fire patrol time feeds, encrypted transmissions. Whoever was watching had been doing so for a long time. The question now wasn't just how they'd done it, but why? Why us? Why the cabin? Why had they gone to such extremes to silence Daniel? That answer came not from the feds, but from an old friend of Daniel's from his time on the Senate Finance Committee. A lobbyist turned whistleblower named Franklin. Mears contacted us in the middle of the night with information he refused to put on the record. We met him in a secured location, and what he told us sent chills down both our spines. According to Franklin, Emerald Holdings wasn't just a criminal network. It was a front for a far more sophisticated scheme tied to land acquisition around future federal infrastructure projects. High-speed rail lines, defense installations, mineral extraction zones. The properties being seized weren't random, they were strategic. Emerald had been buying up land along corridors the public didn't even know about yet. Daniel's cabin, along with a dozen others on Lake Chelton, sat near the projected path of a classified waterway reroute planned as part of a military logistics program. The HOA, it turned out, wasn't just about enforcing lawn rules or controlling the community. It was a proxy army being used to clear land quietly before the government ever announced its interest, so private investors and inside players could profit on the buyout later. That was the secret Karen died protecting. That was what Mitchell was hired to enforce. That's why Daniel, a sitting senator with access to classified briefings, had to be removed. And that's why the threats hadn't stopped, because Daniel's very survival threatened to unravel a conspiracy so large, so entrenched, it could take down billionaires, high-ranking officials, and global investment firms. Armed with this new intel, Daniel convened a closed-door hearing with members of the Intelligence Committee and the Department of Defense. Franklin testified in secret, providing documents, transaction records, maps enough to spark a full-scale federal investigation. But before any arrests could be made, Franklin vanished. One day he was under protection. The next he was gone. His phone was disconnected, his safe house abandoned. No trace. The feds told us it was possible he fled on his own. We didn't believe that. He had known the risks. He had begged us to use the information, to go public. But Daniel couldn't, not yet. Not without ironclad evidence that would stand up in court and withstand the media firestorm that would follow. So we waited, played the long game, fortified our lives and our loved ones, and continued to push forward with the bill's enforcement mechanisms while Daniel worked behind the scenes to build an unshakable case. And then 2 weeks ago, I got another message. This time it wasn't a letter or a photo. It was a drone. I heard it buzzing at dawn, hovering just above the tree line, unmanned and silent, aside from the soft whir of its rotors. I aimed a shotgun and fired once, clipping it enough to crash it into the water near the dock. We recovered it and found a note taped to the underside of the frame. 7 words, "You'll both drown before this is over." The drone was traced to a shell tech firm in Eastern Europe, tied loosely to one of the foreign investors listed on an Emerald Holdings memo Franklin had given us before he vanished. That confirmed what Daniel had feared most. Primerold wasn't just a domestic problem anymore. It was global. Which meant this wasn't just about justice, it was about survival. And that's where we are now. Still at the cabin. Still being watched. Still fighting. But no longer afraid. Because the more they try to silence us, the louder we'll speak. The more they threaten our lives, the more we'll expose their lies. They picked the wrong target when they came after a man with nothing to lose and a brother who would never stop fighting beside him. And if you think this story ends here, you're wrong. Just beginning. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel right now, because the deeper we go, the more truth we uncover. And the next chapter might just blow the lid off everything you think you know about power, property, and the people who will kill to keep both. The silence that followed Senator Mitchell's explosive revelation didn't last long. Not when news vans, investigators, and government watchdogs started peering one after the other at the gates of the HOA. What had once been a tightly controlled, falsely pristine community now looked like the epicenter of a political earthquake. Karen and the rest of the HOA board scrambled to hold emergency meetings, delete emails, shred documents, and distance themselves from the rogue officer Brad. But it was all too late. Mitchell had given investigators everything. Recordings of HOA meetings where threats were veiled in neighborhood niceties, hidden audio from the night of the attack, and a map that showed HOA-owned trail access points the fake cop used to reach the cabin undetected. Meanwhile, my brother Dean, still confined to a hospital bed, became the face of a new kind of public outrage, one not just fueled by HOA overreach, but by a broader system of unchecked suburban authority that had dared to cross the line into sanctioned violence. While Dean worked through therapy and medical evaluations, he had become a symbol. He released a statement from his hospital bed that shook the nation. "I was not shot because of an argument or a mistake. I was shot because some people in power thought they were above the law. It is time we remind them they are not." The phrase "above the law" caught fire online and within days became the slogan for a movement. Protesters, many of them, lake homeowners, veterans, and even HOA whistleblowers from across the country, began marching through the streets of town, holding signs reading "above the law." Not anymore in cabin, not crime scene. Karen tried to hold a press conference to clarify HOA policies, but she was heckled and shouted down so badly she had to be escorted by real police to her car. Even those who had once supported her began to back away. It didn't help that leaked audio had surfaced of Karen joking that sometimes you need a little force to bring people in line. That clip aired during prime time. The Senate Ethics Committee opened a formal investigation, not into Mitchell, but into the HOA's dealings with local law enforcement and their apparent misuse of neighborhood funds to pay for off-the-books security. As it turned out, Brad hadn't acted alone. He had a handler, former private investigator turned HOA consultant, who had orchestrated surveillance on several residents, targeting problematic homeowners like Dean, who had pushed back against illegal building permits and shady land acquisitions. It was revealed that the HOA had an entire folder labeled "resistance files," filled with screenshots, letters, even drone images of people's backyards. The FBI raided the HOA offices, seized computers, and slapped indictments on at least 3 board members, including Karen, whose smug grin was finally erased when she was arrested on live television for conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and impersonation of a law enforcement agency. The fake cop, Brad, turned on her immediately, offering detailed accounts of his training sessions and who ordered what. He confessed to receiving monthly payments through shell accounts linked to HOA funds labeled security maintenance. Dean's shooting was not an isolated incident. It was the final escalation in a long-term campaign to eliminate dissent and silence whistleblowers. But it backfired spectacularly. The governor issued a statement of condemnation, and national leaders demanded sweeping changes to HOA accountability laws. Meanwhile, Mitchell wasn't just surviving the storm, he was steering it. He launched a new bipartisan bill dubbed the Homeowner Protection and Accountability Act, which sought to limit the power of HOAs, require third-party oversight, and criminalize any unauthorized impersonation of law enforcement within private communities. The bill passed its first committee with overwhelming support. Mitchell, once seen as just another career politician, was now viewed as a public advocate. Reporters dug into his past and found a consistent record of standing against abuse of power, something that made his recent silence during Dean's recovery all the more powerful in retrospect. At the lake, our cabin became something of a pilgrimage site, with supporters leaving flowers, flags, and handmade signs thanking Dean and Mitchell. Local businesses that once feared the HOA now offered discounts to anyone showing a badge from above the law. With Karen behind bars and most of the HOA board ousted or indicted, the community found itself rudderless for the first time in decades. And in that vacuum, something incredible began to happen. Neighbors started talking to one another, not in whispered complaints or under HOA watch, but out in the open, organizing real meetings, potlucks, and lake cleanups. A group of residents proposed forming a new community board, transparent, elected, with strict limitations on authority. They asked Dean if he'd consider leading it once he recovered. Though he declined, preferring to focus on his health and family, he offered support and helped draft the group's charter. As for me, I returned to the cabin every week, not just to keep it up, but to remember. To walk along the lake's edge, now free of hidden cameras and patrol drones. to sit on the deck where Dean and I used to argue about fishing techniques, to breathe. That lake, once surrounded by corruption masked in manicured lawns, had become a place of healing again. It's the kind of place where people fought back and won. But we knew better than to relax, because while the lake was calm now, we had learned the hard way how quickly peace can turn to peril when power goes unchecked. The sudden silence that followed the sound of the gunshot was the kind of silence that weighed on the chest like a stone, thick with the gravity of what just happened. The fake officer, now fully unmasked, lay restrained on the ground, courtesy of Senator Marshall's trained security staff who had flanked the cabin quietly during the chaos. Anticipating that the HOA would attempt something drastic, the man had fired, but not at anyone instead. He had aimed into the air, perhaps as a threat or a desperate attempt to create confusion. Either way, it had failed. Karen was screaming from the dock, her plan unraveling as quickly as the cold handcuffs locked around her wrists by the actual state police who had arrived in response to a silent alarm triggered by Marshall's personal security minutes before. All of it had been recorded video footage from drone cameras, body cams worn by the senator's team, and even a few live streams that had already begun to trend. What followed was a media storm that no HOA or corrupt township official could suppress. The fake cop, whose name was revealed to be Trevor Masona, disgraced former rent-a-cop, with a history of impersonation, charges sang like a canary when offered a deal, confessed to having been paid under the table by HOA President Karen Wellen with money funneled through a fake security fund approved by the HOA board months ago. The board, of course, tried to disown the plan, but financial trails didn't lie. And within weeks, the state attorney general opened a full-blown investigation into the HOA's misuse of community funds and illegal actions against private citizens. Karen's attempts to scream entrapment or political sabotage fell on deaf ears as the evidence mounted against her, including messages where she referred to Senator Marshall as a cancer to this community and encouraged extreme actions. The town, once complicit in silence, began to fracture under the weight of accountability. Neighbors came forward, many admitting they had been pressured or threatened into siding with the HOA. Elderly residents spoke of mail tampering, mysterious property damage, and sudden fines that disappeared if they signed HOA-backed petitions. The cabin was no longer just a lakeside home. It became a symbol of resistance, of standing tall against intimidation and corruption. Marshall used the incident as a case study in his next address to the state legislature, calling for stricter laws against unregulated HOAs and impersonation of law enforcement. The bill he proposed passed with bipartisan support, and Karen, she was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, her name forever synonymous with abuse of power. In the aftermath, my brother rebuilt the dock stronger than ever, and we continued to host family gatherings, watching the sun set over the lake that was rightfully ours. But none of us ever forgot that night, the night when someone tried to end a life to silence a voice they didn't understand. Evil wears many uniforms, but sometimes it's exposed not by vengeance, but by resilience and truth. And that's what we'll always have on our side. If you want to hear more true stories like this, where justice fights back against corruption, don't forget to subscribe to the Sham, my stories YouTube channel right now.